I'm Tom Morello, and you're listening to the Ralph Nader Radio Hour.
Stand up, you've been sitting way too long.
Welcome to the Ralph Nader Radio Hour. My name is Steve Scrovan, along with my co-host David Feldman. Hello, David.
Hello, Steve.
Good to have you here as always. And it's also good to have the man of the hour, Ralph Nader. Hello, Ralph.
Hello, everybody.
Today, our guest will be Peter Maybarduk, the Director of Public Citizens Access to Medicine Program. Public Citizen is one of many organizations, including health groups in Peru, Colombia, the Dominican Republic, and Chile, who've been calling for Joe Biden to step up and bring down the barriers that prevent equitable access to COVID vaccines and treatment. In May 2021, the Biden administration promised to support waiving intellectual property protections for COVID-19 vaccines at the World Trade Organization. Patents and other intellectual property laws make it easy for big pharma companies to price gouge on vaccines, tests, and treatment, and make it hard for people to access affordable generics. We'll ask Peter how the Biden administration measures up and about his work at Public Citizen and the United Nations organization, the Medicines Patent Pool. Now, I always refer to the U.S. Chamber of Commerce as the Death Star. Recently, the Death Star has been attacking the head of the Consumer Financial Protection Bureau, Rohit Chopra, for cracking down on corporate crime, or as they put it, trying to, quote, radically reshape, unquote, American finance. Apparently, that's a bad thing. Why would a respectable business organization do that? Maybe because the chamber represents a rogues gallery of corporate criminals, law-breaking big banks, corporate polluters, big tech monopolists, and wage thieves. Public Citizen's Rick Claypool has written a report detailing that corporate crime spree. And in the second half of the show, he'll join us to tell us why the Death Star is launching an advertising drive and screaming their head off about corporate crime enforcement. As always, somewhere in the middle, we'll check in with our corporate crime reporter, Russell Mokhiber. But first, our guest has a relatively cheap plan for vaccinating the world. Who's trying to stop him? David?
Peter Maybarduk is the Director of Public Citizens Global Access to Medicines Program. He is also on the governance board of the Medicines Patent Pool, which is a United Nations organization dedicated to increasing access to life-saving medicines to lower-income countries. Welcome to the Ralph Nader Radio Hour, Peter Maybarduk.
It's great to be with you.
Welcome indeed, Peter. Our listeners who have been vaccinated and boosted, especially interested in what you're going to have to say, they go down to their doctor's offices or the drugstore chains or whatever, and they get vaccinated, and they get a sense of what single payer is because they just show whatever card they have to show, and they don't have to pay for their vaccination. But the government has to pay. The taxpayer has to pay. So I want you to talk about the link between the taxpayers' billions of dollars providing research and development findings for these drug companies to produce their drugs, including the vaccine, and how much is the taxpayer being charged for each of these vaccinations when companies like Pfizer and Moderna hard-line contracts with the government procurement officials. So I want people to understand before you go into how to expand the access to these drugs, including the vaccines, to the people around the world, that you, the taxpayer, funded a lot of the research and development that Pfizer is taking credit for, and what is Pfizer making per shot here?
Certainly. Well, when some of us think about pharmaceutical research, you might think about a pharmaceutical corporation. But in fact, the world's leading funder of biomedical research are the publicly funded National Institutes of Health, with a budget of about $40 billion per year, that is instrumental in the development of most, and some would say all, new medicines at some stage in their life cycle, either via the involvement of federal scientists or early stage research grants that lead to medicines or later stage development. We can look at the example of the NIH Moderna vaccine, and it is the NIH Moderna vaccine, the people's vaccine, not just the Moderna vaccine. And that's because early on, it was NIH and other public entities that were funding coronavirus research, $700 million in early coronavirus research publicly. It was understood that there would be another coronavirus-related threat as far back as 15 years ago. You recall that SARS and MERS were coronaviruses as well. By comparison, pharmaceutical corporations did very little investigational research into coronaviruses. Later on, it was federal scientists that collaborated with Moderna over the course of 4 years to develop what became the NIH Moderna vaccine. Operation Warp Speed then paid for its development and later its purchase and distribution. And in the end, taxpayers paid for about 99% of the development of the NIH Moderna vaccine and paid Moderna about $10 billion in public money to bring that vaccine across the line. Moderna, meanwhile, has about $35 billion in supply deals lined up through the end of 2022. So when we look at the world's most effective COVID vaccine, which is NIH Moderna and Pfizer and others close behind, that's really been a public project through and through, even though we are privatizing the profits and not retaining for the public nearly enough say in how those vaccines are ultimately used and shared with the world to stamp out the pandemic.
Not to mention the price. Let's go to the price now. People go and get a vaccine. They don't have to pay. The government has signed a contract with Pfizer, Moderna, et cetera, to pay so much per dose. Give them an idea of the gouging here. There was a letter to the editor recently of the Post by some medical professors that gave staggering figures here. Can you help us with that one, Peter?
Well, as I say, I guess there's been about $10 billion in public investment in the vaccine. Moderna and Pfizer, others say they're going to be increasing the prices of the vaccine as we move out of the acute pandemic and into the endemic. Moderna's charged the United States around, $15 to $20 per shot. In some cases, actually charged low-income countries more. Charged Botswana, for example, where Omicron was first detected, $29 a shot. So the burden is not evenly shared. But when you think about the fact that the public paid for it in the first place, anything over the cost of manufacturing is essentially a public ripoff. Pfizer, I think, is slated to, is it quadruple revenues and double profits? I might have it backwards, over the course of the coming year. So it's been an incredibly lucrative period for corporations with not enough accountability for the public. The other challenge now, of course, is, as you say, there has been this period of government investment to the tune of billions in purchasing the shots. So we just had, for example, the US government is searching the couch cushions for money to pay for its continuing pandemic response and is diverting $5 billion in other pandemic response activities in order to pay Pfizer for its COVID treatment so that the US government can launch a test to treat program and continue to provide medicine free, as you say, to the people. But that comes at all kinds of costs, right? It comes at a cost of our government's ability to provide other services. And we're now entering a position where, in part because of GOP obstructionism, in part because of White House and Democratic mismanagement, the US government is not going to have continuing funding to provide these medical interventions for free indefinitely. And so we're going to be seeing and feeling that pinch more in the future out of pocket when we go and seek either a booster shot or a course of treatment.
Have you seen any of these contracts that Pfizer attorneys and Moderna attorneys hoist on the federal government? And if so, doesn't it make sense to make them public?
Some have leaked, including contracts, with a number of countries over time. We've reviewed and analyzed some of those contracts, the Pfizer contracts. For example, it makes a great deal of sense to make them public. I think an overarching problem here, Ralph, is that we are still in the middle of a pandemic that has cost 15 million people their lives, according to the World Health Organization, and counting. And the response in many areas is not really being dictated by governments. It's being dictated by corporations. And what I mean is Moderna and Pfizer and others have decided when to sell their vaccines to whom, at what price, and under what terms and conditions. And then those terms and conditions, they keep secret and they retain the right to penalize governments that speak out about the terms and conditions of the contracts at all. So we only know what we know through the occasional leak. But what we know from those leaks, in addition to sometimes issues of price, is that we know that the companies are retaining for themselves. Pfizer, for example, is retaining for itself. It can prevent a country from accepting vaccine donations. So if it doesn't have enough vaccine under its contract, or if Pfizer is late, as the corporations have frequently been, in delivering vaccines, countries can't necessarily just accept a vaccine donation through another service without the express permission of the corporation.
Peter, what is the leverage that Pfizer and Moderna have over all these governments? Some of these are command economies. They're run by dictators. Some of them are leftist governments in South America. Can't they say, hey, you're not going to push us around like this? The WHO can require compulsory licensing. Well, you've looked into how Pfizer silences governments all over the world in vaccine negotiations. Give us a sense of what's the leverage here, and why can't the WHO invoke its emergency powers?
The leverage is shortages. The leverage is that, in the first year of the pandemic in particular, the first year after vaccines were introduced, there were very few sources of supply. And as you know, most countries did not receive significant quantities of vaccine at all initially. But this is an artificial problem as well. The prescription drug corporations have had many countries over a barrel because countries were desperate to get any initial shipment of vaccine however they could to care for their most vulnerable and to begin to get vaccination rates up. But of course, it's also the case that, as you say, governments can choose to share technology in the first place, to license patented inventions, to launch public production projects. The US government has tremendous authority, for example, through the Defense Production Act, through Bayh-Dole, through a series of federal powers to insist that corporations share their vaccine technology with the world, share vaccine recipes with the world, or to launch a public production program to ensure US preparedness in the future. So we could diversify supply and teach more manufacturers to produce and avert some of these shortages in the future. But as we've seen over the course of the past year and a half, many countries have been hesitant to irk the companies that way. We've sort of had a dual problem of corporate power and lack of international cooperation or an insufficient global response to adequately resource the response, to stand up new manufacturing, and to liberate that technology for humanity. However, there are some very promising developments there, including, for example, a project called the mRNA Technology Transfer Hub with a company called Afrigen in South Africa and contributed to significantly by the World Health Organization. It's just one example, but it's an exciting one where mRNA, which is really the standout technology, the pandemic, far beyond 90% effective in reducing hospitalizations and death, has surprised everyone, but it's been controlled, right, by Pfizer and Moderna and limited others. The new WHO project is to teach the world how to make mRNA for a variety of medical applications, COVID, vaccines, but potentially treatments and other interventions as well. They've set up a hub in South Africa run by this company, Afrigen, and spokes, 15 manufacturers so far in other parts of the world that can come to the hub and train and learn how to make our mRNA. They've already reverse engineered Moderna, and they're working, it's like Prometheus, they're taking fire from the gods. They're working on sharing that technology with humanity. So we have options. We've got to invest, and we have to look past corporate power and just insist that pandemic decisions are going to be made by governments accountable to people rather than by corporations accountable to shareholders.
I know some of our more informed listeners are now saying, what about the Russian vaccine, the Chinese vaccine, and the intense work being done in Cuba to develop various vaccines against various variants of the coronavirus, COVID-19?
Yeah.
What can you tell us about the Russian, the Chinese, which have been distributed around the world? They're not deemed as effective. And what's going on in Cuba?
Well, there's some promising results so far out of Cuba with Soberana and Abdullah. Some efficacy rates over 90%. We're waiting to see what WHO says you get through the remaining clinical trial results before we take a position on the vaccines. But the initial results are promising. And what's also promising is that Cuba has committed to distributing tens of millions of doses to other developing countries, has committed to technology transfer, that is using its own personnel, scientists, and staff to help train manufacturers in other parts of the world to make either the same vaccines or to learn the lessons of the Cuban vaccines to produce their own. So, I think Cuba politically is setting a very positive example for paths forward. And hopefully the vaccines will really prove to be low cost, high yield, interventions that will support the global response. I think we have less positive views of Sputnik and Sinovac and the other vaccines that have come out of China and Russia so far, just because of lower efficacy rates, as you say. And this also has sort of been one of the challenges of the pandemic. When Oxford AstraZeneca and the Serum Institute, that was really expected to be the vaccine that powered the global response through the WHO COVAX program and others. And when they ran into both production problems, and then India had its crisis, and there was a need to keep more doses in India, the world was really left without a solution. Moderna and Pfizer were selling to high-income countries, and Moderna in particular was not at scale that way. And so you had many countries that didn't have elsewhere to go other than China and to a lesser extent, Russia. But the problem with that was that it meant that we had sort of two levels of vaccine apartheid. One was just absolute scarcity. Rich countries were getting vaccines and poor countries were not. But then as the pandemic progressed, rich countries were getting the best vaccines and we were providing poor vaccines to poor people, essentially, globally, which is intolerable, right? Everyone should have access to the standard of care. And that requires getting a lot more serious about the power of corporations like Pfizer and Moderna and getting a lot more serious about standing up effective, diverse manufacturing around the world, and then the resources to distribute those tools.
What about asking the impertinent question here? I mean, what does Pfizer and Moderna contribute here other than marketing and profiteering? You got the bulk of the research is done and could be done by National Institutes of Health, contracting out to medical schools and other sources of scientific research, the way they did when they developed the anti-malarial drugs, because the drug companies didn't want to develop anti-malarial drugs that would have helped the situation in Vietnam because it wasn't profitable enough. So the Walter Reed Army Hospital and the Bethesda Naval Hospital, they developed their own internal drug research and development company. And they developed some hepatitis, anti-hepatitis drugs, all on a shoestring budget compared to the huge amount of expenditure that the drug companies inflate to try to show how much they're risking when they spend more on marketing and advertising than they do on research, as the Public Citizens Health Research Group has pointed out over time. Why even bother? You have a global emergency here. 15 million people have died. Over 1 million in the United States have died, not to mention the long-haul effects of COVID, not to mention the disruption of family life, of the economies, of our hospitals, of our lack of preparedness, importing from Italy simple protective equipment because a global managed trade decided it was better to import it from Italy than to build it in the United States. I mean, who needs these companies in this kind of emergency? What do they contribute?
Well, it's a serious question. I mean, I think under our sort of current political economy of it, I mean, Moderna contributed serious research as well. It was a partner with NIH in the development of the vaccine and the mRNA platform technology on which it's based. Pfizer famously did not accept Operation Warp Speed money, but it did take $450 million through its partner BioNTech from the German government. So there's always a public role, but there can be a significant private research and development role as well. And there was in the case of these vaccines. However, as you say, number one, in the case of NIH Moderna, we paid for it, even if there were Moderna scientists involved. And secondly, there is a question about sort of whether that's necessary, what parts of that are necessary. Couldn't some of this be done more efficiently publicly? So I think it's serious. I think there are experiments in that, going on now with sort of different ways to insert the public further into the production process, to have NIH involved not only in early stage research, but later stage development, to look at public production of medicines like insulin, and see if we can come up with a different arrangement where we're not paying for a monopoly while millions of people die. It's, of course, it's a delicate and serious proposition because paying for innovation and being serious about innovation is very important as well. But the public role here is essential and has proven very effective over time. So at a minimum, we need much stronger oversight of the companies. We need governments to exercise the rights that they have in these medical technologies, ensure that they're shared, write conditions into the grants that companies take at the outset that set limits on reasonable pricing. We had sort of fair pricing written into NIH contracts up until the 1990s, and then it was written out of the contract. So we have to write it back in. There's some opportunity now because there will be a new National Institutes of Health director sometime soon who, potentially could take a different approach to pharmaceutical industry cooperation that Francis Collins has over the past 10 years. So we've learned very hard lessons. A lot of people have died. A lot of public money has been needlessly wasted. And assuredly, we can do much, much better if we stand up.
Well, let's go to the grassroots around the world. This coronavirus has been around now for 2.5 years. What percentage of people in Africa, Asia, South America have been vaccinated compared to what percentage have been vaccinated in Europe and U.S., North America?
I haven't checked the tracker in the last couple of weeks. There are still countries that are in single digits, I believe, in sub-Saharan Africa. Globally, though, the total is 60% or so. I think it is increasing, had been increasing very quickly, and has leveled off a little bit recently because of the combination of lack of resources to deliver the shots that we have, and because so many people have been infected, that it is moving from front of mind for some governments and others. But we've seen extreme disparities over the course of the pandemic where, rich countries were able to surpass the 70% target set by the World Health Organization relatively quickly, while we still had single digits in the poorest countries and, well under 50% in many middle income countries. Then, as we say, it's also, pretty significant difference whether people were vaccinated with NIH Moderna or with Sinovac in terms of what they could expect from breakthrough infection. People who were vaccinated by those statistics but received a poorer vaccine were still more likely to die or suffer serious illness. So, the real tragedy now, Ralph, is that our own government, much of the world, is somewhat moving on from the COVID response. We had a very difficult fight over keeping up funding for the global response this spring. And we're thus far not been successful in contributing the billions more that are needed to keep rolling out doses. So now we're at sort of a point where millions of doses are expiring unused on tarmacs for lack of that sort of political commitment to keep fighting. But, there's an awful lot of people working the problem and trying to find ways on limited resources to up those vaccination rates. WHO has sort of moved to a position, well, many health researchers have moved to a position where now the target really needs to be reaching all the most vulnerable people rather than 70% in every country of the general population.
Is there any truth among the GOP claims on Capitol Hill where the Republicans are holding up $15 billion of additional aid for the COVID-19 pandemic, that there's so much in the pipeline already from the federal government that they haven't used, and that's why they're not letting the Democrats pass the $15 billion as they both supported the $40 billion for Ukraine?
There's no truth to that. There is a situation where there were a small number, a very few Republicans, including Mitt Romney, who were trying to get a deal through with a few of their colleagues to put some more billions up per the Democrats' request. And when the deal failed and the administration was able to divert money from other priorities to keep paying for the free vaccines that you mentioned, Romney and some of those other Republicans felt burned. But to be clear, it's not because the money is just lying around. It's because we're sacrificing other needs and we're prioritizing continuing to get people vaccinated. The money is desperately needed, right? The money is desperately needed nationally to keep up any sort of response, to keep up the free services that you mention, and to combat the extremely high incidence that we're seeing right now, as well as the probability of another wave in the near future. It's also needed globally. So the global response is on ice. Our aid agencies and WHO and others are doing what they can, sort of running on fumes and trying to set up test to treat programs to provide, to expand treatment and to expand testing and provide access, immediate access to free treatment in different parts of the world with extremely little money. And as a result, rather than rolling out programs like that globally, now that we have effective treatments, they're having to choose a few countries for pilot programs and take months and months to set it up. There's actually been a recent exodus of staff from the US Agency for International Development, which is charged with a significant part of our contribution to global COVID, because there's no money and because there's an understanding that the United States is not going to fight the global fight the way that we need to. So the circumstance for congressional funding for the domestic fight is dire. For global, it's positively deadly / mostly dead. We have basically stopped making significant contributions to the ongoing global pandemic that will kill millions more people because we haven't been able to get a few $1 billion through Congress. What really ticks me off about this, Ralph, is that the Pentagon budget is $813 billion, right? We're talking about, in the end, less than 1% of that proposed defense budget to end a pandemic that has cost so many millions of lives, or even to continue fighting it. In the end, we couldn't scrape together $5 billion for the global response. And that's just an ongoing crisis that has our attention every day.
Well, if you gave the mission to the Pentagon, there'd be plenty of money.
It's good, and it's actually an interesting point because, as you know, there are times where aspects of the national defense infrastructure have been involved in medical research and development. You pointed to malaria, where effective malaria treatments over the past century were developed by the Walter Reed Institutes pertaining to the U.S. Army, because there wasn't a private market for it and they wanted to protect U.S. soldiers abroad. Now, one of the next potential influential technologies is also being developed at Walter Reed. It is a pan-coronavirus vaccine, so potentially able to attack COVID-19 variants, and future coronaviruses, that is being developed entirely by public money, entirely in-house by the U.S. Army. And the question is, assuming it proves safe and effective, which we always have to see, but if it does, will that be shared with the world? Will that be handled as a public good? Or will that also be licensed exclusively out to a pharmaceutical corporation to make billions and throttle supply? So that's some of the next advocacy that we have, coming up, Ralph, is to insist that the US government share the next generation of technologies and do better than it did this time around.
Well, that's something to be very alert of, and I'm sure your group will alert the public in time to make sure that this is a public good because it's funded by the taxpayer and not given to some profiteering drug company. I want to tap into your knowledge on something I don't think Public Citizen's done enough about, and that is too many of our drugs and active materials in drugs are being produced in China, India, under very lax FDA supervision. They don't have enough inspectors over there. Some of the lives lost in this country because of a contaminated blood thinner over a decade ago from China. Why is it that the health groups, all the way from the public health associations to the medical groups to Public Citizen, are not demanding domestic production of critical drugs? There is no production of antibiotics in the United States today. That is a national security issue as well as a consumer protection issue. Tell me why the entire coalition of healthcare groups, public groups, and professional groups are not demanding a return to the United States of critical drug production.
I take the point, and I certainly agree it's something we can do more on. Something that we have worked on in recent months is calling for a national production program for mRNA vaccines that would be publicly owned, may or may not be contractor operated, a GOCO model, government owned contractor operated model, to ensure that that sort of highly effective pandemic technology is made and controlled here so we can better steward that pandemic health technology. We're also looking at some of the same for insulin, as I mentioned earlier. But yeah, it's a much bigger issue. Issues of active ingredients where, the vast majority is produced out of China with too little FDA inspection. We completely agree. So a few things that can be done. Of course, we need heightened FDA inspection, but we can also bring more of that production home. That too requires investment. I think one area where you get a little bit of, I sort of, both agree with you, and there's like one area of pushback, which is some of this stuff gets tied in with xenophobia, right? And the world has sort of relied on as you know, drugs made in India saved 20 million lives from HIV/AIDS, right? And so there can be value in other sources of production as well. But I think probably the way to look at it is we need higher quality production. We need better inspections. You need resilience and national security protection of critical technologies in the United States and diversified throughout the world. I think the real push that's come out of the pandemic is for more diverse production that is better resourced and more sharing of technology so that the United States has those capabilities and that oversight, and so that other countries do as well. So you don't just get glut in some places and total scarcity in others, leading to preventable suffering and death.
Well, your point on India is well taken. In fact, Jamie Love and Robert Weissman, Haddad, and others found that drug company in India that broke the back of the price gouging on AIDS medicine by U.S. drug companies supported by the Democratic administration in those days. It was $10,000 per patient per year in Africa, and the drug company in India said we can do it for $300 per year per patient, and now it's lower than that. But let's talk right at the interface here. You go into a drugstore in the United States, it's hard to find out where the drug is manufactured overseas. The labeling is not complete at all. And second, there was a recent article saying that the doctors who prescribe medicines for patients don't know from the drug companies how much those medicines are going to be priced at when they prescribe them. How do we deal with those two problems? Country of origin and making price disclosure crisp clear.
Well, for price disclosure, at least there's been a series of legislative initiatives so that information can be better and more effectively shared. The industry resists it, of course, but it's needed. We need price disclosure. We need cost disclosure. That is research and development cost disclosure. And, hopefully this time around in Congress, we will beat pharma.
Well, tell us how people can connect with your organization, how they can go to your website and get far more details. I think you've whetted their appetite for a lot more information that they can use.
Please visit citizen.org/access to learn all about our access to medicines work in the United States and globally. We're fighting here at home to bring medicine prices down and to improve supply resilience, as Ralph suggests, and globally to prevent another vaccine apartheid in the future. So we welcome your support.
People don't understand when they hear about WHO being required to do this, they should do that, they should do this, they should do that. The budget of WHO is about $5 billion. In a recent year, Apple bought $90 billion of its own stock back. In a recent year, the budget of the major hospital in New York City is larger than the budget of the WHO. The budget of Harvard University is larger than the budget of the World Health Organization. So with all its warts, its mission all over the world is overwhelming its small budget. And of course, Trump wanted to get the U.S. out of WHO and cut its budget in his omnicidal ways of doing things in the White House. Let's put it this way. The companies are expecting quicker approvals. As each approval is submitted, it's very few dissent on the advisory committees. It's just boom, boom, boom. The clinical studies are becoming smaller and smaller. So
yeah, I think that's fair. I share that instinct. A couple of relevant developments recently. Did you see this stuff about ADUHELM that HRG was involved with? So there has been sort of like some recent cases where pushback from the advisory committees has led to at least limited guidance of use. So there's that. But the other thing that has been terrible has been the press releases, right? Has been a feature of the pandemic has been announcing safety and efficacy via corporate press release rather than through official channels. So that was extraordinary. And that would not have been taken seriously before the pandemic. And now it is being, reported as rote that Moderna announces, Pfizer announces XY, results before anyone else has had a chance to review the results. So that is certainly an unfortunate sort of diminishing of critical analysis in the public medical sphere that is new to the pandemic.
So before we conclude, Peter, is there anything you want to tell our listeners that we haven't covered?
Well, you'd sort of suggested in your questions this interest in Latin America, perhaps beyond, the treatments, there's a budding treatment access fight beyond the vaccines, right, for the Pfizer drugs. And there's a regional push in Latin America. We now have effective therapeutics against COVID, not only vaccines. And scaling up access to those therapeutics is serious global challenge. For one, because of the lack of global funding to provide testing that's a necessary predicate to then provide treatment. But for another, because of absolute shortages and monopoly control of drugs by companies like Pfizer. So one exciting initiative is that in Latin America, many civil society organizations have come together to demand that their governments authorize generic competition with Pfizer's patented COVID treatment, Paxlovid. And if successful, it means that there would be a more robust and diverse and affordable supply of that effective COVID treatment for those countries. Much like these other challenges we've discussed, that requires overcoming the power of the pharmaceutical companies in each of those countries, but it's also a regional effort with which we can show our solidarity. Many middle-income countries struggle to overcome the high prices that they are charged while being excluded from some of the deals that are offered to the lowest income nations.
Well, we're out of time. Thank you very much. We've been speaking with Peter Maybarduk of Public Citizen. He directs the program that tries to counter the excesses of the pharmaceutical industry and advance broader access to medicines for people all over the world. Thank you very much, Peter.
Thanks so much, Ralph.
We've been speaking with Peter Maybarduk. We will link to his work at ralphnaderradiohour.com. When we return, we're going to talk to Rick Claypool, also of Public Citizen, about his report on how the Chamber of Commerce is representing corporate criminals. But first, let's check in with our prime corporate crime reporter, Russell Mokhiber.
From the National Press Building in Washington, D.C., this is your Corporate Crime Reporter Morning Minute for Friday, July 1, 2022. I'm Russell Mokhiber. The vegan food delivery service Daily Harvest recalled a lentil-based product after customers claimed on social media that they'd become severely sick after eating it. The company said it had received approximately 470 reports of illness or adverse reactions, including gastrointestinal issues and potential liver damage. That's according to a report in the New York Times. Consumers have been using a Reddit forum to share stories about becoming sick after eating the company's French lentil and leek crumbles. One customer described debilitating stomach pain that landed the person in the emergency room. Others said they'd experienced fever, jaundice, and full body itching. More stories from consumers surfaced and spread on TikTok after online influencers received the Daily Harvest product as part of a public relations package from the company. For the Corporate Crime Reporter, I'm Russell Mokhiber.
Thank you, Russell. Welcome back to the Ralph Nader Radio Hour. I'm Steve Scrovan, along with David Feldman and Ralph. The U.S. Chamber of Commerce is very angry at Rohit Chopra, the head of the Consumer Financial Protection Bureau. They are launching an expensive ad campaign targeting him for, in their words, trying to, quote, radically reshape, unquote, American finance, as if that was a bad idea. You can almost see the ketchup dripping down the wall. Rick Claypool is research director of Public Citizen's President's Office, where he focuses on corporate crime and wrongdoing and the ways corporate power distorts democracy. Rick produces reports on a range of topics, including federal enforcement against corporations, deregulation, and conflicts of interest. Today, we're going to talk about his report about how the Chamber of Commerce members, the same people who don't like Rohit Chopra, have paid $154 billion in penalties. Welcome back to the Ralph Nader Radio Hour, Rick Claypool.
Thank you.
Welcome indeed, Rick. The report that you put out January 10th, 2022, is titled, U.S. Chamber of Commerce members have paid $154 billion in penalties since the year 2000. But it's not all the U.S. Chamber members. It's just the ones that you could disclose because they keep their membership secret. It's just 111 corporations who belong to the U.S. Chamber of Commerce. And listeners should realize that although that's a staggeringly high figure, $154 billion in penalties, that reflects a very, very weak law enforcement capability and willpower by the federal government. Very, very low. Probably the enforcement level to be adequate would have to be budgeted and driven by fortitude here in Washington 10 times what it is now. They're very, very low numbers of prosecutors, investigators, and other law enforcement officials against the corporate crime wave. And yet, they still required these companies to pay out $154 billion in penalties. So, first question. I don't recall this report getting much widespread media coverage in January.
That's right. There was a Politico story that got a little bit picked up because the release coincided with the Chamber's annual State of American Business shindig that they put on. And it happened, the original thing that this was responding to, of course, was the Chamber in November, sort of shortly after Thanksgiving, basically using very similar rhetoric to what they're using against Director Rohit Chopra at the Consumer Financial Protection Bureau. Only then it was against the Federal Trade Commission's Lena Khan. And it was the day after the Federal Trade Commission announced a new policy of basically prioritizing criminal referrals from the commission to the Justice Department to sort of enhance the agency's efforts to fight corporate crime. And the Chamber threw a tantrum then, just as they're throwing a tantrum now. And I really do think that when the Chamber is pushing these anti-enforcement efforts and when it's covered by the press, it is extremely important that the public understand and have any reports on that be contextualized by the fact that the Chamber is mad that these agencies are cracking down on corporate lawbreakers because the Chamber represents corporate lawbreakers. That's who pays for the Chamber to exist. That's who it works for. It's not a sympathetic third-party ideological think tank. It is the voice of corporate crime in Washington.
And they come across as, just free enterprise champions when they are really an umbrella for criminal enterprise activities. And listeners, these aren't just financial crimes by banks and insurance companies. These are crimes that endanger the health and safety of the American people. For example, Chevron, oil and gas giant, pleaded no contest to charges for violation of labor, health, and safety standards relating to a refinery fire. Monsanto pleaded guilty to a felony charge of illegally storing a banned pesticide. There are drug companies in this list who have sold drugs and promoted pharmaceuticals that they should not have done on the basis of safety. And it just goes on and on. You have companies like Caterpillar, Citigroup, Duke Energy, DuPont was charged and pleaded guilty to a price-fixing charge. Eli Lilly, Johnson & Johnson, several violations by that company. J.P. Morgan Chase, Kroger, Merck, Norfolk and Southern Railroad Company, Pfizer, a number of violations and penalties, Union Pacific Railroad. The amazing thing about this is the lack of mainstream media coverage. The New York Times will spend more time on a nonviolent burglary than they would on something like this. In the Washington Post, Wall Street Journal, this report should have been all over the media and on TV and radio. And they can't say the public is not supporting tough crackdowns on corporate crime, fraud, and abuse. In your report, Rick Claypool, you cite the following, quote, "Fighting corporate crime is popular. A recent poll found that 70% of Republicans, 70% of independents, 70% of Democrats want the Biden administration to do more to fight corporate crime. These poll results make sense. Consumers don't want to be ripped off. Workers don't want to be exploited. Honest businesses don't want to compete with companies that get ahead by cheating. And no one wants to live on a planet poisoned by corporate pollution," end quote. Where was that poll?
That was a Data for Progress and Revolving Door Project poll that came out in November, I believe. I didn't include it in the report, but there's even, support is even stronger, by the way, for holding CEOs accountable for the crimes their companies commit, including being sent to jail. Like this is 82% of Democrats, 74% independents, and 75% of Republicans.
And speaking of CEOs, there was an article recently that the top highest 10 paid CEOs in the United States, the top 10 highest paid CEOs in the United States, averaged over $300 million in 1 year. Each averaged over $300 million. that comes down by my arithmetic to they're getting paid on a 40-hour week, 50 weeks a year, about $2,500 a minute, listeners, not an hour or a day or week, $2,500 a minute. And that's why they can afford to hire the best lawyers. They could afford to build their own jail. But that's why they get away with so much immunity and impunity. They delegate a lot of the bad stuff down to their companies so they can have deniability. What do you see in the long range, Rick, having corporate crime be a major campaign issue? I mean, with that kind of polling, why aren't there candidates running for local, state, and federal office? We're not necessarily talking about a majority, but why aren't, say, 50 or 100 members of Congress running for re-election or running to get elected, making this a top priority?
Well, of course, I mean, the easiest theory, of course, is part of the influence over, Congress with political campaign spending for not only groups like the Chamber, but corporations themselves and all of the corrupting effects of corporate political spending in our elections. Yeah, it's astounding. And, something else I wanted to highlight about the Chamber's attack on the CFPB was it's almost comical that the Chamber zeroes in on Chopra's statements about corporate recidivism and repeat offenders as being inaccurate. Now, they could clear this up maybe with a conversation with some of the Chamber's members, such as in particular JP Morgan, which has been on the receiving end of criminal enforcement actions from the Justice Department, no less than 5 times in recent years, one of which resulted in a guilty plea. And also with 5 enforcement actions by the Consumer Financial Protection Bureau. That's a problem that, I've been looking at. And that is where, frankly, there is some reason for some hope in some of what the Biden administration has been doing, but they haven't been talking about it nearly enough. The Justice Department has been doing a better job in terms of enforcing the law against corporate recidivists and holding, companies accountable when they breach these leniency agreements, deferred and non-prosecution agreements. But I don't think anybody really is aware of it. And if they talked about it more and more people were hearing about what Director Chopra and Chair Khan are doing and others who are leading the charge to hold corporations accountable, I think many people would be excited to hear that and maybe have, even if people are rightly frustrated about the many failures of what's been going on.
Given the right-left support in the polls for getting tough on corporate crime, law and order, putting the federal cop on the corporate crime beat, it doesn't make sense that there are not at least 50 to 100 members of Congress, progressives that don't rely on Chamber of Commerce type campaign contributions, are not making this front and center. It's been a real puzzle as to why this is not the case. Now, Senator Warren puts out statements, and once in a while Bernie Sanders puts out statements, but they don't demand hearings. Senator Sanders, the chairman of the Budget Committee, he could have hearings on corporate crime, fraud, and abuse that affects the federal budget because they rip off Medicare and Medicaid and military contracts. That's all part of the corporate crime wave cost, and he hasn't done that. None of these other members who have some seniority, they haven't had hearings where a public citizen could go up and testify the way we used to in the old days. They haven't had hearings in the House or the Senate. There's something going on, Rick, that you and public citizens have to get to the bottom of. I suggest you put out a report on how the mainstream media ignores coverage of corporate crime. They do cover once in a while. They dig up something, corporate crime, but they rarely editorialize. They rarely urge Congress to have hearings. And what's worse, NPR and public broadcasting are very remiss in their coverage of corporate crime. Of course, they get a lot of funding from corporate contributors. How do you unlock the situation so you don't just keep year after year putting out reports that are largely ignored? How do you unlock this situation? The next step, Rick, give me some advice.
That's the question. I'm been keeping at it, and I'm definitely tenacious with trying to connect with reporters and elevate this work. It is a constant source of frustration for me that so much of the corporate crime news is relegated to the business pages and framed as, a company is found to have poisoned or killed people, and it's reframed as, well, it's bad news for the company that they have been caught doing these terrible things. There's very
Bad
seldom
for the stock.
That's right. It's very seldom do you hear the voices of the actual victims of corporate crime elevated. And so I think, that busting these myths of the idea that corporate crime is victimless crime and amplifying, these stories and just making them more accessible. One of the things that, I know there's a priority for us and that, we've worked on is just requiring the government to be more transparent about corporate enforcement, in the way that it does with government spending. There should be a database like the fantastic database that, our friend Phil Matera does for a violation tracker, Good Jobs First, out of the Justice Department and the federal government. That would be a resource for the public, not just experts with the time and energy and curiosity to go digging in the weeds.
Yeah, well, we've been working with Public Citizen to get Congress and the Justice Department to establish a corporate crime database. If they don't have a database, the press is less likely to report it. They have a street crime database, but they don't have a corporate crime database. We've been asking attorney generals now for decades, going back to the Carter administration, and they keep putting it off, or they say, well, we have to have Congress appropriate a budget for this, and we haven't been able to get that done. Here's what I'd like our listeners to realize. We have drafted corporate crime letters to senators and representatives, and not just for Congress Club members. We've drafted them. Some members have sent them in. They've been brushed off by most members, either ignored or formed letters. These letters demand congressional hearings. They demand updating the federal corporate criminal code, which is absurdly obsolete. They demand action to protect the American people, their health, their safety, their pocketbooks, their children, their environment, their workplace, their marketplace. And it's not getting very far. Anything else you'd like to tell our listeners that we didn't cover, Rick?
Well, I guess, on that note, to your listeners, if you're interested in this reports and the other reports that I write and that other researchers at Public Citizen are writing, you can find them at citizen.org/reports, where you'll find, the reports on corporate enforcement and money in politics, the issues that I cover, as well as a range of issues across all the, health, safety, and democracy work that Public Citizen does.
You put out a report under the Trump administration showing the decline in fines, criminal penalty fines. It was pretty new data that you all combined to compile, and it got virtually no coverage. But now I understand that the Biden administration isn't all that great either. What's your latest on the level of criminal prosecutions and fines by the Biden administration's Justice Department, for example, under Merrick Garland?
Yeah, well, it's disappointing, but on the other hand, it's ticking up. So the most recent data that we have is for the fiscal year that was from, literally before they started announcing their, policies that they're going to start trying to ramp up enforcement on corporate crime. So I won't sugarcoat it. It's not good. It's lower than ever. But I am still hopeful because they actually are, changing policies. I'm seeing results come out with the big cases. It will be more clear, as the months go on. I don't think it's going to be enough in terms of what the increase needs to be to really bring it back, even to, where it was among historic averages, where right now we're looking at there are about 90 corporate prosecutions every year, where, the average in the past was about double that. And it's certainly not enough to deter corporate crime, which should be the standard. It's still the sense that getting caught is so rare and impossible, and that the consequences are so minute as to make breaking the law and getting caught worth it, that there's still a great deal of work to do.
Well, what I'd like to find out more about is how many actual corporate criminal lawyers are there in the Justice Department, and how many enforcement agencies are there in the Department of Health and Human Services and other agencies, so we can total up the number of pursuers of corporate criminality. And I doubt whether, in terms of the number of lawyers working on this, that it is equivalent to any one of the top giant corporate law firms. I think the corporate law firm giants probably have more lawyers than the number of lawyers in the Justice Department working on corporate crime. We don't know exactly what the number is. They don't exactly publicize it, but that would be another good report by Public Citizen. Well, we're out of time. We've been talking with Rick Claypool, who is the regular discharger of data and reports on corporate crime for Public Citizen. And you can get his reports by going to the website, Rick?
It's citizen.org/reports.
And members of the Congress Club and others, send that letter on corporate crime demanding answers to your senators and representatives. If you don't get them, contact us, and we'll make the calls to these recalcitrant lawmakers on Capitol Hill. Thank you very much, Rick.
Thanks, Ralph. Thanks, Steve.
We've been speaking with Rick Claypool. We will link to his work at ralphnaderradiohour.com. And that's our show. I want to thank our guests again, Peter Maybarduk and Rick Claypool, both a Public Citizen. For those of you listening on the radio, we're going to cut out now for you podcast listeners. Stay tuned for some bonus material we call the Wrap Up. A transcript of this program will appear on the Ralph Nader Radio Hour website soon after the episode is posted.
Subscribe to us on our Ralph Nader Radio Hour YouTube channel. And for Ralph Nader's weekly column, you can get it free by going to nader.org. For more from Russell Mokhiber, go to corporatecrimereporter.com.
The American Museum of Tort Law has gone virtual. Go to tortmuseum.org to explore the exhibits, take a virtual tour, and learn about iconic tort cases from history. And be sure to check out their online gift shop. You'll find books, posters, and flaming Pinto magnets and mugs for all the tort fans in your life. That's at store.tortmuseum.org.
You should read Capitol Hill Citizen. The pilot issue is out. It's only $5 to cover the shipping. To order your copy, go to capitolhillcitizen.com. The producers of the Ralph Nader Radio Hour are Jimmy Lee Wirt and Matthew Marin. Our executive producer is Alan Minsky.
Our theme music, Stand Up, Rise Up, was written and performed by Kemp Harris. Our proofreader is Elizabeth Solomon. Our associate producer is Hannah Feldman. Our social media manager is Stephen Wendt. Join us next week on the Ralph Nader Radio Hour when we welcome Dr. Bandy Lee back to the program to talk about the January 6th hearings and the psychology of Donald Trump. Thank you, Ralph.
Thank you. If you know any parents losing control over their kids to the internet gulag and the junk food industry, just go to inspiringtweens.com. Inspiringtweens.com.
Hi, this is Jimmy Lee Wirt, producer of the Ralph Nader Radio Hour, and welcome to the wrap-up. First, we continue our conversation with Peter Maybarduk.
You want to say it slowly again, the website?
Sure. The website is citizen.org/access.
Citizen.org/access. And give the website for the Health Research Group for people who want to subscribe to Worst Pills, Best Pills, so that they know which medicines they should reject that are approved by the FDA because of side effects, and which medicines that are approved by the FDA who have minimal side effects.
Go to citizen.org and follow the link for safe and effective drugs, and you can learn all about our work to keep medicine safe, to challenge pharmaceutical companies, to keep prices low and quality high.
To go to Worst Pills, Best Pills, the best bargain in the consumer protection area, I think, and you can get it accessible 24/7 on the website whenever you need a medicine. Check it out. The Health Research Group has been famous for its accuracy and its completeness on the subject of pharmaceuticals for sale, all approved by the FDA. Some of them have bad side effects, some of them have less side effects. That's where the name Worst Pills, Best Pills comes from. Thank you very much, Peter. Steve, David?
Yeah, thank you, Ralph. I've got a question. I would think a listener, such as myself, would sit back and when I hear about how I pay as a taxpayer all of this money for all this research, and then it's given over to a pharmaceutical company that privatizes the profits and gives their CEOs bonuses. It seems like a bad deal. And you mentioned something in passing called buy dole. which I understand refers to Senator Birchby and Robert Dole sponsoring a law in 1980 that was signed by Jimmy Carter, which kind of set the deal for how this medical research is given to pharmaceutical companies. Can you expound upon that law, how it came about, and what a bad deal it is?
Yeah, let me sort of go at it a little bit of a different way, because it's been a little while since I read the law history. The National Institutes of Health supports $40 billion a year in biomedical research and development. That's often searching for early stage promising candidates. There's research conducted at federal labs, there's research conducted at universities, and there are grants to corporations. Now, NIH does not commercialize those technologies and largely relies on the big pharmaceutical companies for late stage drug development, clinical trials, expensive protocols at the end. So our public research agencies look to license, typically exclusively for commercially valuable inventions, those publicly incubated technologies to massive drug corporations. So the corporations take the fruits of early research and they turn them into monopolized products, and they put them through the last stages of development. And then they sell them back to us at prices that are not only unregulated, but monopolistic, right? Because the whole point is you've got patents and other government granted rights that insulate these companies from competition. So that's how it works, or rather fails to work. The most potentially lucrative publicly funded research does get turned into a product by a corporation, but that corporation has near total say-so over price and supply and whether anyone else will be able to rely on any part of that medical technology to move the science ahead.
Why these U.S. drug companies, supported by all these tax dollars and research development, charge the American people the highest prices in the world compared to what they can charge in areas like Canada and Egypt?
Because we don't fight back, or more specifically, because we don't have, for one, price negotiation. So Medicare is the world's largest drug purchaser, more than $100 billion per year, but does not have the right to sit and negotiate prices with drug corporations directly. Most other countries do at least negotiate for price, but we just kind of sit back and take it. There is a second underlying problem, really the principal problem, which is the grant of the monopoly in the first place. So, corporations, of course, are charging as much as they can. And in the context of drugs, they're doing it in an environment with no competition for potentially life-saving technologies. So there were congressional hearings a few years back with Senators Grassley and Wyden, where documents were produced from Gilead Sciences showing how they came up with their $1,000 a pill hepatitis C drug price. And it was just a color-coded chart, sort of green is fine and red, like that's too much, where the criteria was just when insurers will stop paying and when we'll get congressional inquiries and unsustainable public outrage. Had nothing to do with research and development costs. It had nothing to do with like a reasonable or efficient return or any such thing. It was only about at what point outrage would be unsustainable and where essentially the price would be so high that the cost of the company would be outweigh the benefits. So they drive prices right up to that point where public outrage is going to turn the tables on them. And prices have been going up radically in recent years. There was just a study published in JAMA that found that over the past 15 years, the average price of new drugs has gone up 20% per year. And so now we have far more six-figure drugs than we did even. Now six-figure new drugs is the norm for price, whereas 15 years ago, it was pretty rare.
Just to clarify, it's only in America. Other countries control drug prices. Canada controls drug prices, not as much as they want to, but other countries control drug prices very rigorously. So you have these American taxpayers, they fund the government research and development on drugs, which are then given away exclusively to one drug company or another under monopoly conditions, as you point out. And then the drug companies return the favor to these taxpayers and their families by ripping them off at levels unseen in the rest of the world. What would you call the American people who allow that to happen? Give me your adjective. Give me your noun.
It's flaccid, weak. I don't know where we are. We're not fighting back the way that we need to fight back, certainly. I mean, we found actually that for the top 20 drugs, if I have this right, the top 20 selling drugs, the companies made more money from the United States than they did the rest of the world combined. So yeah, prices are way higher in the United States, and we need to at least control those prices and pass drug price negotiation, which is on the table right now, which is a part of reconciliation, a part of Build Back Better, if we can ever get that across the line to start down the road of better pricing. But part of what I'm trying to say is that's going to be a long fight too. Even if we pass that negotiation, the negotiation legislation will start weak, the power will start weak, we're going to have to strengthen it. And at some point, the United States and all countries of the world have to deal with the underlying problem that we give drug corporations a temporary monopoly that they can fully exploit. And that's why we don't have anywhere anything approaching fair or reasonable pricing. And it contributes to many millions of deaths routinely.
And the CEOs of all these companies should be poster childs all over the country where there are consumer protests, because it's a pay or die situation for a lot of people. If they don't pay, they die. They don't get the drug they need, and they're not going to go on crowdsourcing or beg on cable TV, which is seen in other countries as disgracefully shameful to occur in one of the richest countries in the world. David?
Let me ask you about international civil disobedience. What would happen to a team of doctors and compound pharmacists who they have the recipe for the Pfizer vaccine and they set up shop in a sub-Saharan country through invitation from that government, and they just start manufacturing the vaccine and challenge who? The WTO to sue them, to arrest them? How does that play out?
I think the fear is the worst part. I think that's exactly what should be done. And in fact, that is what WHO is really doing in South Africa. They just went ahead and reverse engineered Moderna and then started teaching other countries how to do it. And they're actually in dialogue with Moderna. So, the world has not fallen down around them. And, Ralph, as you know, in my own work, I've spent quite a bit of time helping countries in Latin America, which, as you point out, there's some positive developments there, issue licenses to just authorize generics to produce the same expensive patented drugs. So this can be done through available legal avenues. You don't actually need civil disobedience. Any government can sign a one-page document saying we're going to license production of this medicine nationally or license its import. That's possible under existing rules. But yeah, we can also practice and should practice civil disobedience in many cases, I think, importing patented medicines despite the patent rules, producing, and invite the companies to attack. It's going to be a PR nightmare for them in cases of the most important drugs. So that's one of many possibilities that's coming. But if you talk to sort of scientists about how this actually works when they're experimenting with new drugs and candidates, it's often like you just infringe. If you're trying to push ahead the science, you go ahead and do what you need to do in the lab and let the lawyers sort of work out the rest. But I think the political fear of drug corporations and lobbyists has stymied some of that activity, has governments cowarding rather than acting boldly to protect their people in the short and long term.
In big tech, they say it's easier to ask for forgiveness than it is for permission. So isn't the shortest distance between 2 points renegade compound pharmacists and doctors just doing it? Isn't that the quickest and easiest way to get this into sub-Saharan countries? Just set up shop and start making the vaccine?
Well, there are other
ensure
issues.
safety and effectiveness, David.
Exactly. Yeah, there are other issues there. I mean, when we're talking about vaccines, of course, it is a complicated production process. I mean, the recipes for Moderna and Pfizer are hundreds, if not thousands, of pages long. I'm trying to recall. So in cooking it at a commercial scale, there is a lot to do well. So it's not an instant thing, and it's not a make it at home in your garage sort of thing, nor should it be. But it is the case with some careful planning and investment. Countries and institutions that have serious research and manufacturing capacity can make these vaccines well and can bolster global supply and improve regional resilience. And that is certainly something that should be done and is being done. I mean, one of the sort of glimmers of hope as we move deeper into the pandemic is the world is getting more serious about medical security and more serious about diversifying production and sharing knowledge. President Biden opened the second global COVID summit with an announcement that the United States would share a series of COVID medical technologies with the World Health Organization for global use, not just the doses, but the knowledge, right? Sharing doses is charity and sharing knowledge is justice. So the means to produce medical technology, that's something that is gaining more traction as we go, late to help with the current pandemic, but very important to the future.
And now we speak more with Rick Claypool.
Let's make this comparison. If you had a massive street crime wave in New York City and there were only 20 police as part of the police force, what would most people say? Hey, we need more police. Well, I'm going to ask you to give our listeners a rough estimate of what the budget is for the Consumer Financial Protection Bureau and the Federal Trade Commission compared to penalties totaling $154 billion since the year 2000, a fraction of what was stolen and looted. What are the budgets for these two major law enforcement agencies against corporate crime?
Not nearly enough. I don't have the numbers up on my head, but they need to.
Okay. Well, the budget for the Federal Trade Commission is somewhere between $350 and $400 million for the entire economy. The Consumer Financial Protection Bureau may be a little bit bigger, but not much. The Auto Safety Enforcement section of the NHTSA agency in the Department of Transportation is about $100 million. That's involved recalls of defective cars, auto safety standards, upgrades, etc. So basically, we know what the score is here. The score is to have the government go through a few cases as if they're doing something. But when you quantify it, it's ridiculous. We've talked on this program of credible estimates that $350 billion a year is looted in the form of billing fraud and abuse in the healthcare industry. That's $350 billion, or about 10% of all that's spent on healthcare in the United States. And there are only a few dozen prosecutors and investigators that are working on this, and they don't get back less than 1%. They get back from these crooks. Looting Medicare, for example, is over $50 billion with a B a year that could go to health care for the elderly and others who are the beneficiaries of Medicare. So let's ask this question. Where did the $154 billion go? It didn't go to expand these enforcement agencies' budgets, did it?
No. I mean, so this includes state and federal. So,
okay, and where does the money go? When
right, yeah, generally it goes to the Treasury. I know there's, is my understanding. Now there's, some subset, which is a small fraction of it, goes to the Victims of Crime Fund, which is something that's separately, they had to pass legislation, I believe it was in 20 or 21, where it's the way that the payments to the Crime Victims Fund that were previously structured was that only criminal penalties would go to that fund. But because of the Justice Department's over-reliance on leniency agreements, the deferred and non-prosecution agreements, the fund was shrinking to a point of unsustainability, right? And so this is helps pay for, people who are fleeing violent spouses and things like that. They had to, instead of, it's good that they did this, but they changed the law so that also penalties paid as part of leniency agreements go to the fund. That's a great short-term solution, although, what they really should be doing is prosecuting those companies and casting aside this experiment with, leniency agreements.
Well, let's end this interview with a recommendation. I think this should be a conference that Public Citizen can sponsor of citizen groups who are committed to doing something about corporate crime. And a lot of these law professors, many of them young, are coming up terrifically knowledgeable about corporate crime and what should be done with it. They're often profiled in the Corporate Crime Reporter by Russell Mokhiber. And really take it to the next step, Rick. What do you think of that?
I think that's a fabulous idea.
Because you must be very frustrated. You put out these reports again and again and again, and not many people hear about them. And, of course, members of Congress don't rush to get copies of them and invite you to testify that the way they used to in the 60s and 70s. So we have a lot of groundwork to do, listeners, and you've got to be part of it, because without you back home, these members of Congress are going to look the other way as they get their pockets stuffed with corporate criminal campaign money.
Thanks, Rick. I really appreciate it. I think you came up with a great tagline for the Chamber of Commerce, and maybe they could put it on their logo when you said, "The voice of corporate crime in Washington."
Yeah. I might get in trouble for that one. We'll see.
I may have Jimmy make that up as a logo. Take their logo, which I just looked up, and it says something about supporting free enterprise. Instead of that, put "The voice of corporate crime in Washington." The U.S. I always refer to them as the Death Star when I'm talking about the U.S. Chamber of Commerce. It's pretty crazy. And I'm always struck by the idea that people always talk about business. Politicians will talk about being business friendly. And what they really mean is management friendly.
Right.
It's not really good for business, monopolization and concentration of power and being able to get away with polluting and all of this, or not paying your workers anything. It's not good for business. And Ralph knows this well from the auto industry, where all the protections that these Detroit Congress people, especially John Dingell, did to help the auto industry actually allowed the Japanese and the Germans to come in and make safer, more fuel-efficient cars.
Right,
exactly. Americans were too lazy to do.
Also, it's a competitive disadvantage against small business, honest small business. When crooked big business gets away with it, they disadvantage competitively small business who isn't trying to get away with it. Like the key examples, adulterating food products, like they adulterate orange juice.
Right.
When they say a lot that what these agencies are doing is poses a threat to the free market system and such, and what they really mean is that it poses a threat to their American oligarchy.
Yeah.
Rick, have you read my 6 pages or so on exposing market fundamentalism from 3-4 years ago?
I'm sure I have, but it's
you should reread it, because it's the biggest list exposing free market fundamentalism. Like, you can't have a free market if you have fine print contracts that are imposed on people. You can't have a free market with corporate crime in the marketplace. You can't have a free market if there's monopoly in the marketplace. You can't have free markets if government procurement tilts toward the big guys and their campaign contributions against other procurement bidders. So you should have people at Public Citizen read that. Nobody's put together that list. And there's one more I've got to add. How do you have a free market when people don't even know what the price is of pharmaceuticals? They're increasingly, Steve, you're not even told the price.
Right, of course.
You should circulate that, Rick, because that is the main ideological weapon in the last 150 years they throw. We just obey the verdict of the marketplace.
Right.
Don't blame us. But they control the marketplace. The free trade is corporate managed trade. So you should circulate and have them read that.
Ralph, just for one more second, along those lines, Ralph, my daughter just made a car trip from Texas, from Austin to LA to visit us. And she had to stop for gas a number of times. And she would put her credit card in the slot. And the company said they were going to put $150, $175 hold on their credit card for however much gas they were buying, which was probably 40. She was buying $40 or $60. So they're using that money, putting that hold, and they're able to use that money, gain interest on that money before releasing it to you. That seems like, I don't know what that is. Is that criminal? How are they able to do that?
They're likely, not necessarily, but they're likely they can refer you to a fine print on page 6 of a contract you never saw.
Right.
Just like unilateral change of a contract. Like if you have frequent flyer miles and say 30,000 gets you a free round trip, they can change it to 40,000. You say, I didn't agree with that. Oh, yes, you did. In the fine print of a contract you never saw, they say you agreed to unilateral alteration of the terms. I mean, it's total criminal stuff, but, not technically. But She should challenge that. I never heard of that. She should really challenge that.
Yeah.
And that's a wrap. Join us next week when we welcome back forensic psychiatrist Bandy Lee to discuss the January 6th hearings and the state of Donald Trump's mind. Until next time.
Stand up, you've been sitting way